When my grandmother felt the slap on her ass, a wicked grin spread across her face. She turned to her neighbor, her eyes filled with mischief, and without a word, she grabbed his hand and led him into the bedroom. They began to have passionate sex, fueled by the thrill of secrecy and betrayal. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. The affair blossomed, and my grandmother became a master of deception, hiding her infidelity from my unsuspecting grandfather. A neighbor visited her regularly, sneaking into the house when my grandfather wasn't home. They indulged in their forbidden desires without leaving any trace behind. But as time went on, guilt began to creep into Grandma's soul. She could no longer bear the weight of her deception. And one fateful evening, when the neighbor appeared at the door, she decided to end the affair and confess to my grandfather that she was cheating on him with the neighbor. With trembling hands, she opened the door, and instead of greeting the neighbor, she mustered up the courage to tell him it was over. Tears streamed down her face as she confessed her betrayal, knowing that her family would be shattered by her act. The neighbor, shocked and hurt, left in a fit of rage, vowing never to return. My grandmother, broken and remorseful, approached my grandfather with a heavy heart, ready to face the consequences of her actions. But to her surprise, my grandfather, though hurt and betrayed, forgave her. He understood the complexity of human desires and the mistakes we all make. They worked together to rebuild their relationship, and their love was stronger than ever before. As my grandparents tried to move on from the affair, an insidious plan was brewing in my grandmother's twisted mind. She couldn't bear the thought of her lover leaving her, so she came up with an insidious plan for revenge. Late one night, under the cover of darkness, her grandmother contacted a known hitman with whom she had connections. She offered him a large sum of money to make her neighbor disappear forever. The hitman, lured by the promise of riches, agreed to carry out her sinister plan. Days turned into weeks, and Grandma grew increasingly anticipatory. She knew that once the neighbor was gone, she would be able to live in peace. But she didn't yet know that her actions would cause a storm of chaos and destruction in her unsuspecting family. On a moonless night, the killer silently crept into the neighbor's house, armed with a deadly weapon. He approached the unsuspecting neighbor, preparing to end his life. But just as he was about to strike, he was startled by a sudden noise. It was my grandfather, who found my grandmother's behavior suspicious and decided to investigate. He followed the hitman, determined to get to the bottom of it. In a desperate attempt to protect his neighbor, my grandfather pounced on the hitman, engaging him in a brutal fight for survival. The room turned into a battlefield filled with the sounds of grunts, screams, and clashing bodies. Blood flooded the walls, and my grandfather fought with all his might. But alas, the killer was experienced and ruthless, and eventually overpowered my grandfather. As my grandfather lay lifelessly on the floor, my grandmother emerged from the shadows, a twisted smile on her face. She had achieved her goal, but at a cost. Her lover was gone forever, and her husband now lay dead at her feet. Haunted by the consequences of her actions, my grandmother fell into a depression. A load of guilt and regret consumed her, driving her to the brink of insanity. She was left to live out her days in a world stained by her own wickedness,